the sustainable last mile. My guest is Andre Pharand. He is Global Management Consulting Lead for Postal and Parcel Industry with Accenture. Hello, Andre.
Hey, how are you?
Excellent. Thank you so much for spending the time with me. There's a new Accenture study out entitled The Sustainable Last Mile, Faster, Greener, Cheaper. What's your definition of a sustainable last mile?
So a sustainable last mile is a last mile that can help lower the carbon footprint and secondly, lower congestion, which is very important primarily for cities, but also for the population within the cities.
What are the elements that go into a so-called last mile ecosystem, all the parts that come together?
Well, I would say there are probably four major ones. The number one is the retailer. If you assume we're talking about e-commerce delivery here. Number two is the delivery company. So this could be, an integrator like a FedEx, postal company like USPS, or it could be one of the regional or gig economy type players. Number three is the city, which controls all the infrastructure. And then the last entity here in the ecosystem would be the consumer. They're the ones that create the demand for e-commerce, and they're the ones that set, I guess, the expectations for faster delivery and also faster, cheaper, greener delivery.
And with those four parties in mind, you have the emissions that are coming from warehouses and trucks and whatever else it takes, whatever other energy it takes to get this product to somebody's doorstep. So that's all part of the consideration. It's a very complex ecosystem, though, and I would imagine there are some big challenges in bringing it all together and ensuring some level of sustainability. What do you think are the biggest challenges in reaching this goal?
Well, I guess what our research found, and we looked at what if we were to drive 50% of all the e-commerce delivery using local fulfillment. Local fulfillment is defined as using fulfillment which is closer to the end consumer. Mm-hmm. Think about stores, think about shopping malls, think about micro fulfillment centers. And what we found through this, modeling was that it is possible to achieve a faster, greener, cheaper last mile delivery. Number two is that back to, I guess, the question around complexity, no one entity can actually solve this problem. This has to be a concerted effort across the entire ecosystem and sometimes involving sharing of assets. And then I guess the third point is that it is absolutely necessary for particularly the delivery companies to rethink their last mile and for retailers to rethink their whole e-commerce fulfillment to address the needs and to become, fulfill this faster, greener, cheaper last mile.
When you describe local fulfillment, I assume there's no hard definition of that in terms of like actual distance, just closer, you said, than a traditional distribution
You're absolutely
center.
right, but there are some benefits to this. Now, what our modeling did model was a closer fulfillment center, which means that it helps in a number of ways. Number one, for example, it can help reduce the stem time associated with fulfillment centers that might be located outside the city. You're talking about smaller vehicles and more, efficient vehicles because you don't have to carry as much into the neighborhood. We're talking about more eco-friendly solutions as well when it comes to, if not delivered to the actual door, that there are some locations typically known as PUDOs, which are at least more conveniently located and closer to the consumer. We're talking about use of, more eco-friendly vehicles. We didn't exclusively look at electrical. This was not a study around electrical replacing gas, but we did put that as part of our mix. And those are some of the things that help reduce. And we also looked at technology to help optimize the last mile, which can help reduce the use of energy, the distance. So that also helps make the last mile greener.
Are these typically small facilities? I mean, I'd like to talk about micro fulfillment centers in a second, but just in general, these local fulfillment centers are, I assume, because in order for them to fit into an urban footprint, they're going to need to be smaller in size than the giant warehouses at the edge of cities and in rural and suburban areas, right?
Well, that's the assumption. I mean, I think also with there's just a rush right now for warehousing and industrial, real estate. But the concept, I guess the best way I could describe it is what happened even during COVID, because what we found is, I mean, we started this research before COVID, but COVID, unintentionally helped fulfill some of the, I guess, the conclusions out of this study. For instance, of what a local fulfillment center looks like would be, for example, take your just your store, right? A store that for a while it was not possible to use. I mean, there was the different delivery companies were at capacity, and so the retailers had to be a little bit more creative. And what they did is they started fulfilling from stores. So what this means is that the store starts taking on a different role for the retailer, and that could be a good example of what a local fulfillment looks like. So it could be usually what we would assume is it could be a store, it could be something that would be of a smaller footprint than your standard, let's say, Amazon warehouse outside the city. So it would be something in between.
And in fact, these micro fulfillment centers that we're hearing so much about these days are often placed within an actual brick and mortar retail store where they've cordoned off a certain part of that store for that purpose. Do you see that as being a common practice and even more common going forward?
Well, we're going to see this. It's absolutely materializing. However, I think that's for a specific segment of the retail landscape. If we're dealing with the large, hyper markets, think about Walmart, Target, Carrefour, or Tesco, there's no doubt that they're already doing this. So they're taking, and they have the density, the retail network density. When you have 4,000 stores across the U.S., you're pretty darn close to a lot of the population. However, if you're any franchisee, a store or an owner of one store, I mean, even a Victoria's Secrets or some of these kind of chains don't have the same, I guess, density as a Walmart or a Target. They're going to have to look at alternatives. So this is where shared warehousing and micro fulfillment does come into play, and also to increase just the overall footprint and coverage of even some of the pure e-commerce players.
So a smaller retailer without the advantage of a big box store to fit this kind of thing within their four walls probably has to turn to a third-party logistics provider or something, or an outside outsourced provider of warehouse space within a local area, right?
That's our assumption, yes.
Yeah, yeah. Now, of course, we're talking about measuring the carbon emission from that local fulfillment center to the doorstep or wherever it is that that package is ultimately going. What about measuring the carbon emission that gets it into that local fulfillment center in the first place, from probably, once again, either direct from a manufacturer or more likely from a giant fulfillment center somewhere distant? Is that part of the calculation here?
That's a very good question. What we did was I guess we had to stop somewhere, and what we did was isolate this to the last mile.
Mhm.
Why we made that decision is because the last mile is arguably the least efficient of all of the different steps, right? If you go from collection, transportation, sortation, delivery, it represents about 50% of the total cost, and part of that is about 80% of that cost is labor. So we decided to focus specifically on the last mile because it is the most important step, and for retailers that are doing delivery, especially from store, there's no such, there's no pre-step to this. So we decided to focus more on that, I guess, area of delivery.
I see. Okay, I get faster, I get greener, but how is this cheaper?
Well, it's cheaper in the sense of you do eliminate a few steps. So think about the traditional way of delivering a parcel. You'd have to induct it. It would have to go to some kind of sortation facility. Could be outside the city. Then it would have to come back in. So when we talk about local fulfillment and fulfillment much closer to the home or the door, wherever the consumer wants it delivered, typically what we're talking about is smaller distances and less energy used to deliver the package. And typically also you're talking about higher route and drop densities. So it also increases the efficiency of the delivery.
Again, for these local fulfillment centers, some of them are within retail stores, and therefore we do have the buy online, pick up in store options. So you've got the consumer going to the center to pick up the package. The carbon emission involved in the consumer's drive to the center, is that figured in to this last mile measurement?
That's a very good question. We did look at that, and we did assume that there is an omni-channel component to this. We also assume that with delivery from store to the consumer and with the consolidation of these deliveries, for instance, a typical vehicle doing deliveries might contain between 100 and 200 packages that can easily eliminate between 80 and 160 trips to the mall from passenger using passenger vehicles, and from consumers actually going to the mall just for a pickup.
Mhm. We've been talking about, assuming, I think, that we're talking about an urban setting here. But there are, of course, consumers in rural areas, exurban areas, and suburban areas. Do these models fit there as well in any way?
So our research was done in three cities that represent, I guess, a good mix around the world. So we looked at Sydney, Australia, we looked at Chicago, and we also looked at London. And what we found, and so these are primarily urban settings, to be fair. So we did not necessarily look at suburban and rural. But what we found from our research in doing this analysis across these three cities is that we by going towards a local fulfillment model, you can help save between 16 and 26% in terms of carbon emissions between 2020 and 2025. So there are some significant benefits in going towards a local fulfillment.
Well, we've been talking up to now, a lot of people about the stampede toward last mile to meet customer expectations, but it's very valuable to look at the carbon emission and sustainability angle as well. And Andre, Pharand, you've helped us to understand what those factors are and what direction we might be going in that respect. Thank you very much for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.